This is the story of the Lokomotiv Yaroslavl disaster. On the 7th of September 2011, a Yak-42 operated by the charter company Yak Service was operating Flight 9633 from Tunoshna Airport in Yaroslavl to Minsk in Belarus. They were ferrying some very important passengers, the Lokomotiv Yaroslavl ice hockey team. They were a part of the KHL, and they were very popular in Russia at the time and in the world of hockey. They were superstars in their own right. That day the weather was good, with light winds and tons of visibility. The Yak-42 entered the runway and lined up with the centerline, all ready to go. The runway was 9,800 feet long, more than enough for the Yak-42's takeoff run. If things went according to plan, they'd need just 3,900 feet of the runway. The pilots were satisfied and advanced the throttles to takeoff power. The plane began rolling down the runway, gaining speed with every second. It was hurtling down the runway at about 130 knots, but the plane did not lift off. Something bounded to the earth. The plane was running out of space. The runway soon came to an end, and the plane still wasn't airborne. It traveled past the end of the runway and on the ground for another 1,300 feet, and it finally lifted off. The plane struggled to stay airborne, swaying precariously from side to side. It couldn't climb, but it was off the ground. But luck soon ran out for Flight 9633. In the plane's flight path was an antenna. The plane at this point was only 20 feet off the ground, and it could not clear the antenna. The left wing clipped the antenna, and the plane came crashing back down. The plane broke up during the impact. The tail section of the plane ended up in the Volga River. The rest of the plane was strewn down the extended centerline of the runway. Of the 45 people on board, only one person survived. No one from the hockey team survived. Right after the crash, a ton of attention was put on the carrier, Yak Service. It wasn't the best airline out there. For example, in 2009, the airline was investigated by the European Commission for safety concerns. Even the Russian authorities imposed sanctions on the airline. Moreover, the airline was forbidden from flying into Europe in 2010 for a few months. This airline was not in good shape. The investigators had a mountain of documents to go through, and they had some stories to tell. They found that the training that had been given to the crew was substandard. The training that was done was marred with breaks and holdups. It wasn't a continuous training program. That was not all. These pilots were trained on both the Yak-40 and the Yak-42, and they flew both planes. The Yak-40 and the Yak-42 aren't that different. The Yak-42 is just a newer, more modern version of the Yak-40. But there were enough differences that pilots needed additional training to fly the Yak-42. Usually, pilots are trained to fly one and only one type of aircraft. If they want to fly another type of aircraft, even from the same family, they'd have to undergo simulator training and tests so that they understand the new plane really well. Here, they went back and forth between both planes all the time. On this plane, the first officer was the more experienced pilot. He in fact held a high position in the company, but he only had a few hundred hours in the Yak-42, and that's why he was in the first officer's position. This power dynamic had an interesting effect on the cockpit environment. As the crew prepared for the flight, they talked about things that didn't matter to the flight, and they swore quite a bit. It was almost as if no one was in charge. There just wasn't any cohesion. This nonchalance by the pilots was on full display once the plane was taxiing. Usually, the pre-takeoff phase is very busy in the cockpit. Pilots have to calculate a number of things for the takeoff, things like stabilizer deflection, the speed at which they lift the nose of the plane, the center of gravity of the plane, the takeoff distances, etc. But on Flight 9633, this is what happened. The observing pilot would call for the checklist by saying, "Takeoff data checklist," or "before starting engines." And the pilot in command, the one that was actually flying the plane, incredibly just said, "Calculated, reported," without doing any of the calculations. Instead, the pilot in command just guessed the values. The way they taxied exemplified how they carried this flight out. They entered the runway at taxiway 5, and they lined up with the runway. They actually should have gotten on the runway, backtracked down the runway, got to its end, made a 180-degree turn, and then taken off. But instead, they just got on the runway and started their takeoff roll. This reduced the amount of runway that they had by about 300 meters or 984 feet. I mean, they still had more than enough runway to take off, but they did not have enough runway in case they needed to reject the takeoff for any reason. The pilot in command, that is the first officer, did not think that the plane could make the 180-degree turn needed to line up with the runway, but measurements taken after the crash showed that it was more than possible. But none of this actually explains the crash. Sure, they guessed a lot of stuff, and they did not go through their checklist methodically, but the plane should have been able to take off. Their guesses were kind of close in a way. This plane should have been able to fly. The flight data gave them a clue. They looked at the acceleration of the plane as it was on its takeoff run. At first, it was accelerating at about 5 kilometers per hour per second, but later that acceleration dropped down to 3 kilometers per hour per second. Something was holding this plane back. When the plane was at 100 knots, they tried to lift off, but the plane didn't budge. Actually, they tried to lift off too soon, so it's understandable why the plane didn't take off. But this plane did not move at all. The nose was stuck to the ground. They needed to figure out why the plane was not accelerating as usual. They looked to see if the wheels jammed up or if the spoilers deployed. The data was clear. The spoilers were retracted, and the runway did not show any marks to indicate that the wheels had jammed up. For the brakes to activate on their own, you'd need 2 independent mechanical systems to fail. The probability of that happening was very low. Besides, the pressure in the braking system changed during the takeoff sequence. If there had been a failure, that would not have been the case. This left one scenario on the board, and it was one that was quite unbelievable. To quote Arthur Conan Doyle, "Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth." That one remaining theory was that someone in the cockpit was applying the brakes. Now, you don't need to be an aviation enthusiast or an aviation specialist to know that applying the brakes while you're trying to take off is a bad thing. To see what this would look like, they got an identical plane and they tried taking off from a very long runway with the brakes on. It matched flight 9633 almost exactly. The test flight showed them that you did not need a lot of force to compress the brake pedals, just about 10 to 12 kilos of force. The runway was a bumpy one, so one of those bumps could have easily depressed the brake pedals, just enough to engage the brakes. They then noticed a subtle difference between the Yak 40 and the Yak 42. It's the smallest of differences, but it might have cost 44 people their lives. On the Yak 40, the older plane, the brake pedals had these little ridges on the bottom so that the pilot could rest his feet on the pedal itself. This was fine, the pedal was designed to be used like that. But on the Yak 42, the plane that they were flying that day, the pedal had a different design. On the Yak 42, your heel would rest on the floor and you actuated the pedal with the top part of your foot. If you put your entire foot on the pedal like you would on a Yak 40, you'd depress the pedal just a bit, activating the brakes. It would be almost imperceptible to the pilot, so it's entirely possible that you'd be braking without even knowing it. We don't know who applied the brakes. It could have been either pilot. But it is to be noted that the first officer was taking meds because he was losing sensitivity in his extremities. This would have disqualified him from flying, which is why he did it in secret, without anyone else knowing. It pains me to say this, but a crash that claimed the lives of 44 people, one that broke the hearts of hockey fans around the world, ultimately came down to one pilot hitting the brakes when he was not supposed to. After the crash, Russia started an inspection of its airlines to make sure that all airlines were capable of providing safe flights to the people that flew on them. Yak service had its license revoked on the 21st of September, and they never flew again. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.